Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. It's Wednesday, July 31st, 2024, and today we're going to be answering three questions we've been hearing from international educators over the last 7 days. Before we get into those questions, as we do each week, we take the questions we have here on Wednesday from our newsletter that comes out on Monday mornings. And there are now over 2,000 subscribers to our newsletter in the international ed world, and we're so grateful for all of you who have decided to include SMIE Consulting's hot takes on the news stories of the week in our newsletter on Monday called All the SMIE News Fit to Share. It comes out in two forms, either on via email, which you can sign up for through our website at smieconsulting.org/subscribe. Enter your details and you'll get that delivered in your inbox Monday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern. If you prefer to get it via LinkedIn, we have an easy way to subscribe there. And again, between those two, we now have over 2,000 subscribers to the newsletter. Very excited about that landmark for our content that's going out weekly and our hot takes on the news stories of the day. So we take the questions we do here from the news stories we see that we deliver on Monday. We answer those a little bit more in depth and talk about how the answers to these questions might affect what we do here in international education in the United States. So we'll get right into the questions. The first one up is, how do you decide whether to enter a new market? And this story, or this question really, comes from a number of different facets in the process at my institution of deciding on whether we enter into a couple of new markets this year and what the criteria are for getting in terms of pull factors that might be attracting students from that country to the United States and to our programs. Also push factors that might be motivating students in a country that might want to leave, and other factors like that. We look at numbers in the United States. We look at top sending markets. We look at those kind of factors as some of the grounds for why we might want to enter into a new market. If we have an alumni population there, if there is a particular affinity with our part of the world, or if there's an immigrant community in our area. All of these are kinds of things that you often can use to justify, hey, there's a reason why we need to be going after this market because of the connections we have, because of the push and pull factors that might be attracting students. But all of these are kind of important to factor in. But one of our friends and colleagues at INTED put out a blog this past week, particular about a country in Africa, Tanzania. That's an up-and-coming market, and they go through a variety of kind of push and pull factors that might be indicating this country is ripe for institutions to consider engaging in. But what we do, what they have done is they've identified at least 5 questions that you can and should be asking yourself as an institution before you decide, hey, let's invest in direct recruitment in this market, maybe some digital media in a market if there's a niche. So here are the questions that they suggest you ask. First up, is there a growing youth population? Now, Africa is, as a continent, is the fastest growing region in the world, and I think we've heard by 2050, it's going to have over half the world's population under 30 years old. So those kind of numbers, the amazing growth of 1 billion people coming from Africa living in Africa now, and those numbers in terms of the youth populations growing just phenomenally, is always a good sign that the continent is ripe for further engagement. But that's one of factors that our friends at INTED identify. So growing youth population, is that happening in that country? Is there a growing middle class or significant GDP growth in that country that suggests that maybe there's a middle class or upper middle class that can afford to consider sending their son or daughter to the United States, where tuitions are amongst the highest in the world on average? So that's an important factor. Is there enough families in that country who might be able to afford your education, your total cost of attendance? So second fact, or third question, can a set of families afford travel costs and your program tuition? So that's kind of tied in with that second one that we talked about earlier. A fourth question, do your programs line up with the job opportunities in that market? And this is something that is sort of the, not silver bullet, but or hidden gem that people are trying to find, where there's good fit, and where are the data sources that might suggest that there's a huge demand for particular programs or kinds of jobs in a particular country, and whether or not the supply of university places in that country can meet that demand. So that's often a good sign of where the interest is, at least with job opportunities. Maybe not exclusively job opportunities, but certainly majors that are in demand in a particular country. So there's maybe a little disconnect there, not quite connecting the dots fully on that note, but certainly in-demand majors are certainly something that can push students to your academic programs if they know that, hey, I don't have an opportunity to study what I want to study here because I'm trying to get a job in this field, but there aren't enough places at universities, so I need to go elsewhere. If that's the case, then you might be in a good position because that will help prepare those students for jobs back in their home country, which is a win-win for everybody. And the final question that folks at INTED ask is, can you provide a welcoming community, academic support for these students on campus? So that's certainly information that you want to be considering. Obviously, you don't want to be attracting students to your campus if you don't have services that can meet their needs while they're on your campus. And this might be a question that probably isn't specifically relevant to like Tanzania in this case. It's more of a general concept that you want to keep in mind. But do you want to be bringing in students that you can't support? No. So support means, do you have those kinds of services from their initial arrival and orientation, to housing, to food service, to campus ministry perhaps, to student organizations, to academic support services, to writing centers, to English language centers, to career services, to student employment, to alumni offices. Are all of these services in place to help support that academic and eventually career prep journey for students that are coming to your institution? And if you can say yes to those, and you have documentation that yes, you're meeting the needs of your graduates and your current students, then certainly you're probably in a good position to explore adding a new market to your list. And these are the kinds of things that you want to be looking at. Certainly, those 5 questions aren't the only questions. I've talked about some of those that we mentioned earlier, push and pull factors in a given country that might be attracting them to the United States, and how you market the United States, not just your institution. That we talk about that regularly here on the Roundup, is how are you talking about in your messaging to students, how much are you talking not only about your institutional strengths, but the strengths of the United States as a market for these international students. That's the piece that we often lose perspective on, is if we're not talking about the value of our nation as a whole, not just our institution, we're missing an opportunity. Because particularly in this day and age, and we'll talk more about the competitive advantage we have in the United States right now compared to all the other major destination markets, UK, Canada, Australia, that have been imposing limits on international students coming in, whereas the US has primarily kept their open doors through actually trying to meet a huge demand for student visas here in a lot of major source markets. So that is a piece that we certainly need to think about. And these 5 questions from INTED are great. Looking at the data certainly is an important piece. And these are some data questions that they ask. But the data questions are, is there currently a market in that country for students that are coming to the United States? Is it growing? Is it shrinking? All of those things are things you want to consider as well. Not just the open doors data, but see this by the numbers data. What levels of study are students from a particular country coming in at? Is it all at the undergraduate level? Is it more ESL community colleges? Or is there a large number in high schools? So these are the factors that you might want to conclude in your planning for why you go into a new market, or where that new market might potentially be accessed best. So great question to start this week on the Roundup. We are also looking at a potential new market that right now we had plans to travel to this fall, but because of the political situation in that country right now we can't travel there. So we're doing some different things with our agent partners who have offices in that country to try and leverage us maybe for digital recruitment until things settle down, where we can make an actual trip to that country and work with our partners in country to make direct appeals to students and families in those countries. So that also has to factor in. Is it can I travel there? Is it a level 4? And this country is right now, so I can't go. So I'll plan maybe in the spring. If things calm down, I'll go back. But we have the data to suggest that, hey, the numbers have been increasing, applications, enrolled students from this country in the past couple of years, that we have agents who are increasingly engaged there that we want to leverage to reach further better class of students to potentially enroll from that country. So these are the things you need to think about. Now, next up is a question that we often don't ask enough, and we alluded to it earlier, is how does the U.S. stack up against the competition? And the competition for international students is for U.S. institutions is not just your competitors domestically, and oftentimes those are very different beasts in terms of who's going after international students compared to your domestic equivalents. It's what other countries' universities are recruiting your same students, or are those students also considering? And that's the reality of today's market. It's an increasingly diverse landscape of destinations that international students have to consider when they are looking for potential places for their degree studies abroad. There are not only the traditional English language destinations, English language speaking destinations, but also English language programs that have popped up. And I think the biggest growth, 46% of the increase in international programs in English has come in non-native speaking countries, in China, in Germany, in other countries that are catering to international students that they see as, well, they've been coming to English-speaking countries for years, and in order for us to get a better slice of that pie, we need to offer programs in English to them. So many countries have done that, even like China, as we talked about, has, where English is not the national language at all, it has custom programs for students in English. Thailand is another example of that. They have begun attracting international students to their campuses because they offer programs in English. So when we talk about our competition now, it's not just your neighbor down the street or in your state. It is countries across the globe that might be competing for the same students. We've been sharing articles over the past few months about how Chinese students are increasingly selective in terms of where they're going to look, not just at the U.S. anymore, or not just U.S., UK anymore. They're looking at destinations closer to home in Southeast Asia. Hong Kong has been probably the biggest beneficiary of Chinese students, mainland Chinese students coming to Hong Kong over the past 3 to 4 years. So we see a lot of increased competition, but we know amongst the primary players, the big four, so to speak, U.S., UK, Canada, Australia, the U.S. right now is the only one that right now, and again, that's always a caveat of pre-elections and what might happen post November 6th, what the election results might mean for the next 4 years. But certainly our competition, primary competition, have taken significant hits because their governments in Canada, in the UK, in Australia have imposed caps or cuts or restrictions on new international students coming into their countries. And when governments take negative actions like this, you see the reality of drop-offs in interest. Some of that is real, with UK applications from international students being down 27% in the last quarter, or to date, years to date. We're seeing that in deposits as well, being down for the UK. We've seen in Canada, the vocational college sector, particularly amongst private colleges, has been decimated. Many are going to be closing or consolidating. You see a cap that's been imposed in Canada, a 30% reduction for this year and next year. Whether they actually make those caps or not is another story. But there are other factors we'll get to in a third question about Canada, but there are other factors that are making Canada less attractive. Australia, similar situation. There are caps now, a 50% cut in net migration numbers to Australia. Not all of that's going to be student focused, but it's already taken chunks out of the vocational college sector. the English language training sector, where visas have become increasingly hard to achieve, that certain colleges in those two sectors and programs in those two sectors are being on the chopping block, so to speak, and may be forced to close for financial reasons. You see even some of the group of 8 are talking about, well, maybe we need to have our own caps, and what does that look like, and is this reasonable to do? So there's an article from the Council of Graduate Schools that takes a look at this, specifically with India. What's led to the increase in interest from India in the United States? The kind of the changing tide or growing tide coming from India. Why are they coming? Because in the UK they were prohibited from bringing at the master's level, bringing dependents in, and many of them have family they want to bring for their program, so that's no longer an option. So they're looking at other markets. You have U.S. having huge numbers of Indians coming for STEM programs, where they are 60 to 70% of OPT students every year. They're 60 to 70% of H-1B recipients every year. So there's just huge demand now. Whenever something that is floated that might impact positively the students coming to the U.S. when it comes to post-study work options, there's always a rush. There's always an uptick in interest. So that is not slowing down at all from India. The embassy and consulates in India are reported record volume over last year's already records they were setting in terms of student visa applications. It's probably going to beat those records from last year this year. So we're seeing major interest there because of faltering opportunities in other markets. You see in another article from University World News, Rachel Skolton, who's at Loyola, Maryland, has made a case on where the U.S.'s competitive advantages are related to their major English-speaking competitive nations, and there's citing the data from the IIE data recently, and another data from Barnard and others that have showed that between 1.3 or 1.8 to 2 million international students by 2030. There's just huge data that is on the side of a strong continuing surge in international student interest in the United States. So to think that we could be doubling our international population in the next 6-7 years in the United States is just phenomenal, and means a lot of potential room to grow. And that's the great thing about the U.S. When we talk about competitive advantages, I talk about this all the time. In the United States, we are at about 5-6% of our total higher ed population is international at this point. So look at Australia, Canada, UK are 25 to 35%. At some institutions, it's 45 to 50% at some of the top institutions. And we have a little bit of similarity here in the US when it comes to our top institutions being 35% international. But the lion's share of our colleges and universities that are enrolling international students still have significant room to grow their numbers. One of the reasons they can grow their numbers is our campuses in the U.S., as opposed to most other colleges in the rest of the English-speaking world, are designed to house students on campus or in the immediate area through apartment complexes that the institutions own. That does not exist for the most part at overseas institutions in the other major destination markets. We know housing has become major issues in Canada, in the UK, in Australia for international students trying to find affordable housing, or a housing where they can actually be 2 people to a 1-bedroom instead of 5 people to a 2-bedroom, or 6 people to a 2-bedroom apartment. So those stories are all over. And there were stories last year of international students renting a square on the living room floor to put up a tent, and that's where they lived, in an apartment that was already chock-a-block with other students. So these are the issues that in the U.S., in the whole, we have much more capacity to grow our international populations. So those are the things we need to talk about when we look at what Canada's doing, where we look at what Australia is doing in the UK. Even though there's a new Labour government in the UK, that doesn't mean necessarily the doors are going to be flung wide open. They're not going to be raising tuition to help deal with the funding challenges that institutions are facing in the UK. They're going to be supportive of recruiting international students, but there's no not necessarily any policies that have said we're going to provide money in the budgets for institutions to go do this. They just might free up some visa issues and or log jams in visa processing that might occur. But are they going to flung those doors wide open in terms of funding to help make that happen? Probably not. So there's a lot out there that we really want to take a look at when you're looking at the competition and how the United States stands related to that for what we can and should be talking about in terms of our strengths as not only an institution, but as a nation for enrolling more international students. So hopefully you're doing that in your messaging. All right, and last question of the day. It is, has Canada begun rolling up the welcome mat? And 2 years ago, you would never have thought this would happen. Canada had this reputation that international students are welcome. It's an immigrant nation, much like we are in the United States, but certainly it is an immigrant nation that needs people from overseas to help keep the economy robust and to keep things moving along, because there's a distinct lack of domestic population to fill jobs in certain markets, in certain specific fields. In the recent past, that has meant a lot of vocational education colleges, 2- and 3-year programs, have enrolled students from India largely that might already have master's degrees that are coming to Canada to work at a vocational college to get that credential in that country that will allow them to stay and work and then eventually become residents. So there are certain provinces in Canada that flung the doors wide open for international students. Less populated provinces that might be off the beaten path and certainly have some other challenges for international students that chose to come there. You would see in certain Atlantic provinces, and Cape Breton University is kind of the poster child for this, that they ramped up their international numbers so significantly that helped fund their institution and keep the doors open, so much so that they neglected a very important issue in that town in Cape Breton, that they did not have the housing to accommodate all these extra students that they're bringing in from overseas. So Canada has had a reaction to that. We know that 50% of all international students in Canada are in Ontario province, Toronto, Ottawa, that area there. And then 20% or so are in British Columbia, mostly in Vancouver. So those two provinces alone account for over 70% of all international students in the country, which as of last year was almost 1 million vocational and post-secondary bachelor's, master's, doctoral programs. So Canada has, as we talked about earlier, they've imposed a 2-year cap of a reduction of 30% per year in the number of international student study permits that are awarded. And I don't know if they're going to make it this year to actually get to that cap number. It seems there have been a lot of exemptions to it. Any master's and doctoral programs seem to be exempt from those caps, but it seems to be targeting vocational education primarily. But there are signs that the tone has certainly changed in the Canadian government. An article from India Today, which has been Canada's #1 market, it says, Canada rethinks long-term visas for international students. Not all can stay. Canadian Immigration Minister Mark Miller said a study visa wasn't a promise for a long-term stay in Canada. He said international students should study in Canada and return to their native countries. Wow. His remarks come amid a cap on visas for international students by the Trudeau government. So that certainly is a very different message than perhaps was being told in the last 4 or 5 years, that Canada is not now an open door for international students to walk through and stay. So that's certainly one thing. We also see a change in policy that is going to require all international students who want to change institutions once they arrive in the United States. This is something in the U.S., we see this happening with transfer outs. That's a story we'll cover probably in depth next week. This is where a student enters the country on maybe your institution's visa, and then decides before they enroll to transfer out to a lesser known school, probably one that they wanted to go to all along, that they have decided, I don't really want to pay the tuition at that school. I just got the visa, got in the country, now I want to switch to an easier path to residency. But we know that door might be closing as well. But one of the things the IRCC has proposed, it's not actually guaranteed yet, but it may likely happen, is that they've proposed an amendment that requires students to reapply for a study permit if they change schools in Canada. And that causes some delays, and the designated learning institutions, the DLIs, is what they call registered colleges and universities authorized to enroll international students, that they have to apply for that new study permit, which is not a guarantee, but it does require an extra fee of $150 Canadian dollars to apply for, and it's certainly something that could take a period of months, not certainly going to happen right away, so it may require that student to stay at that institution for a period of time. So there are some issues there in Canada now that's affecting interest in studying there, in India and China, we'll talk about in a second. But other countries that have previously looked at Canada as a easy path to residency or to work in residency may not be that way anymore, or to certainly not the same extent that it was. The final piece related to the Canada question is a story that actually no country ever wants to see written about its country. It's an article about Chinese students studying in Canada. That the headline is "Chinese international students passing on Canada, monotonous and unaffordable." So a very stark criticism of Canada. That they are, it's an article called from the National Post that says that more Chinese students are electing to study at home, where China's universities are outranking Canadian schools. So rankings is being used as one of the arguments in this article to justify, well, Canadian institutions aren't as good as they used to be, or Chinese universities have gotten better. So they are now staying home or closer to home, as we talked about earlier, Hong Kong especially as a destination outside mainland. So there are some really worrying signs for Canadian institutions amongst prospective international students that might suggest the country is not as welcoming as it once was. So we'll see if that has legs and continues to be a challenge north of the border, but certainly there are some warning signs, as we said. Well, that's all we have for you for this edition of the Midweek Roundup. Once again, thank you for taking the time to be a part of the conversation, and we look forward to chatting with you again soon. Cheers.